detail about, but is federal data archiving requirements, which are frequently required with federal funding or have different requirements basing on funder, and working with sovereign nations, and the idea and the value of having data sovereignty for sovereign nations. And those two things can come into conflict with one another. So we'll be discussing what that looks like. I do want to talk about, before we begin, just acknowledging that there is a lot of movement that's working right now towards tribal data sovereignty, that our positions, mine, Katie, and Anna's, as non-native researchers, it's not really our, not within our role to necessarily come up with solutions for data archiving requirements for tribal partners, although of course we're willing to help. But what we're going to be focusing on today is instead as researchers who are working with tribes in whatever stage they are with archiving agreements, about how you can ethically and authentically move forward with relationships and engagement in this research. And I do want to point out, regardless of anything we're talking about, that there is no one size solution, and everything we say or we're going to talk about is going to be either large or ethical, or considering working with specific tribal nations, and each nation has its own code and laws and practices and culture, and that if you're working with a tribe, you need to become familiar with that particular tribe, because not any single one is like, they're all their own nation, so they all have their own current practices and changing practices around that. So with that said, we can go ahead and move to the next slide, where I just want to define data archiving for you if you're not familiar with this as a concept. The quote in here is from the National Science Foundation, and it really kind of summarizes the reason for data archiving and why the federal government is moving towards it even more. Recently, the Biden administration has pushed data sharing, this concept that if you receive federal funds, that your data that comes out of your federal funding will be something that you can share or will be shared with the public. Because basically, if you have federal funding, your work is publicly funded, right, through those federal funds. So the concept is that if you're collecting data that is publicly funded, that your data should return to the public. So there's been movement towards that, and the argument, I think, is an argument that most of us would agree with, right? That we want data to be open and shareable, so that findings are replicable, that findings are something that, you know, other people can check the work that was done to make sure science is good science. Also, that there is more equity in terms of researchers, because I think one of the things that research or writing on data sharing really talks about is the importance of removing gatekeepers to being able to access and use data, particularly as a researcher, because we aren't all in a position where we can get federal funding, or we're at universities that or places that have support for that kind of federal funding. And so having data sharing archives, having places where researchers and students can access that data, actually moves us towards having anyone can access and use that data to publish and research. So it not only advances the goals of science, but it also advances this open access. So Biden's administration has put out a call to go even further with data sharing. So you'll have seen, like, NIH put out some new guidelines around their data sharing practices. And we'll start, I think, even hearing more and more about data archiving and data sharing in the coming months than we have been. So that's just a basic overview, but the idea of data archiving is really taking that data and making it in a way that while you are still keeping the confidentiality of your participants, that other researchers and others can gain access to that data and do other studies or replicate the study that you have done before. So I think with that, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. And this is Katie.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Bridget. It was, as Bridget mentioned it, there's so many different factors that come into play, in terms of what are tribal laws, policies, regulations around data sharing, data archiving. And then, of course, there's, funder requirements. And also within funding agencies, I've had funding from all of these federal agencies. There's variability in the extent to which waivers are granted. I think the other thing that's really important to mention too is, when we talk about sharing findings of studies, that's different, right, than archiving. And so we all want to disseminate our findings to diverse audiences, to practitioners, to policymakers, to academic audiences. And I think those, again, in our work, we always go through tribal council, or I'm sorry, research review boards or tribal council, depending on the tribal nation. When we're collecting data on sovereign lands, we go through the Great Plains Tribal IRB for approval on all of our publications. When we're collecting data off tribal and trust lands. But then the issue really is like, what happens with that actual data? And do you put it in a repository? Do you allow people to access it? And so, Bridget talked about NSF. I know I have been recently consulting with a group, where they're really requiring them to have, prior to the notice of award, those memorandums of understanding in place around what happens with data archiving and data sharing. And so I think there's really an increased focus on the importance of this. And as many of you know, the ways in which research historically have been done with tribal nations, indigenous relatives, particularly with academic institutions and federal agencies, have been quite egregious. So my experience also is with NIH CDC. They do require archiving, but there are also exemptions and allowances to that. So, of course, there's public repositories. Some tribal nations have their own entire wing of archiving, and so they manage those requests. For many tribal communities, that's not something there's infrastructure, capacity, or resources to do. But NIH and CDC do allow for waivers, and so and a lot of the work that we do, of course, tribes own the data. And that we work, it's very rare that we just say under no circumstances will we ever absolutely share. Usually in our data management plans that you submit as part of your grant, we work with tribal communities and indigenous partners to outline what are the times and ways in which data may be shared. And again, this can be for specific requests for that you as the research team run the analyses for them, right? This could be pieces of the data that are shared, of course, aggregated, de-identified. But very rarely, at least in my work, would we put the data in repositories. We usually have all of those that are controlled through the tribe and through our advisory boards. It also becomes a lot more complex too when we're thinking about where the data are collected. And there's been a lot more, I think recent discussions, right, about data ownership and data sovereignty when data are being collected with indigenous relatives off tribal and trust lands, and kind of who are the gatekeepers of that data? How does that look? And I think in some ways there's often more complexities there. And I'm happy to speak more about kind of how we do that and that work as well. But in my grant through NIH and CDC, we've never had issues essentially asking for waivers of archiving and repositories so that we maintain control over the data, and we kind of take requests on an individual basis for that. And that's something that you put in your, when you submit the grant, you have a data archiving plan and you make a case for what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're doing it. And it tends to be a living document as well, so that there can be changes made to that as well. My experience is that although the NIJ does allow for waivers, that they are I think the most stringent about that. And so I've not had luck with the NIJ on that. And so my funding with indigenous populations has been exclusively NIH and CDC, although I've consulted on NSF grants with that. So again, there's so many different factors. I wish we could come in and say, here's exactly how it works. but it's extremely complex. I mean, my experience too is that a lot of researchers are really trying to navigate this, and you know, not all tribal communities have policies on this. There's different, you know, depending on the tribe who you go to for this information. You know, and I would, in short, you know, really allow ample time. This is not something, you know, start thinking about this prior to submitting the grant. Start thinking about this as early on as possible, because these are things that take time and have to be navigated not only with funding agencies, but also with your institutional review boards as well. So we, you know, for all of our institutional IRBs through UNL, they are jointly reviewed through UNL and tribal committees, Great Plains, etc. There's, you know, constant making sure that the UNL IRB is aware of what does the agency require, what does your data management plan say that was approved, what are tribal policies, and so forth. So again, I think the biggest piece of advice is start early, because this is something that does take a lot of time and thought, which is really, really important to do this work in a good way.
Thank you, Katie. So as Bridget mentioned, data sovereignty is the right of a nation to collect and manage its own data. And this is sometimes paired with data governance, which is the ownership, collection, control, analysis, and use of that data. And Katie just talked about different ways in which organizations will do that through archiving. But we know that tribal nations have a need for data. They use data internally and externally to make decisions, to inform policy, to shape and reform programs. In terms of some of our work recently related to sex trafficking, there was a general call to understand how sex trafficking operates differently within and across tribes and Native communities, because we also know that current information on trafficking is not specific. It has often ignored certain populations, including tribal populations. And for example, what we do know from official sources, whether that's the Trafficking in Persons report from the federal government or national nonprofits like Polaris, is that, you know, there have been some issues and inconsistencies when it comes to what the data looks like to include those groups. And so there's a lot of challenges that come with that. And I'm going to pause there and turn it over to Loretta to talk a bit about what some of that might look like. Oops, and Loretta, you're muted.
Yes, since working with the team, I've learned that it's really important to have as part of the training for going into and preparing for research within sovereign Indian nations is to understand historical generational trauma. So having that background and knowledge can be directly taken from the people who have that lived experience. In other words, having traditional practitioners on your team is a requirement for that need, and a lived experience in terms of their own healing, because there are some of us who have gone through and looked at our own generational trauma and how it plays out in our daily lives. And we've had access to the resources that have helped us, each one. So there are many, and I'm trying to compile a list of resources of people who can be act as resource referrals for that need whenever anybody is thinking about research for historical generational trauma. And it's always the root of most of our needs on reservation and off reservation. The data collection and sharing aspect then would have to have people be able to help with that process of understanding the data as it is relayed through the research person. And of course, that understanding that there would be permissions and ways of making it confidential which brings me to some of the survival tactics that we might observe during this time. Will take the experience of people who have gone through their own healing and are practicing their traditional ceremonial ways with that need. And there are many of us who have chosen that path. And so I'm really feeling like our resiliency is helping us in this way, that we can be part of the whole effort. The ways to deal with the pain of generational trauma, historical generational trauma, as it is inherited. There are many sources out there that you can refer to understand the context. And there's ways that would have to require people who are experienced in knowing what those survival tactics are, because there are many, and there could be ways that the research itself or the collection itself can trigger those trauma responses. So to be aware of that, and to have good basis for understanding that. And also the survival tactics are many in terms of secondary effects. I guess you could look at a whole number of ways that people have tried in my community and in my experience, ways of dealing with that pain, that some people have called it a soul wounding. And so that's how I've been taught, is how to look for that in terms of working with people who are going to look at their generational trauma. So the survival tactics that might appear as secondary effects could lead you off onto a path where you look only at how we relieve that pain. And oftentimes when we pick up those ways to heal, to relieve that pain, it often has negative consequences in terms of becoming outmoded sooner or later. For instance, alcohol, drug addiction, which is my field, as a way of relieving pain, sooner or later becomes outmoded, and then it reverses into not helping at all. But then you have to deal with those effects. So there are a number of survival tactics that I have looked at, and but it's just basically a need to control, because when you're a victim of trauma, there's that deep need to have some sort of control over the issue. And so you reach out to anything that will give you that sense of control, which alcohol or drug addiction can do for a while. And there's other modes too: gambling, credit cards, just a number of ways that are evident out there in the populations. The reason why survival tactics would be a good way to conceptualize the data that you hear from survivors or people who are working on these issues is it impersonal. It gives a way to state just the survival tactic and remain confidential of the actual particulars of ceremonial experience, because our ceremonies are so sacred that, and we've had so much issues with misappropriation of our ceremonial ways, and it's very rampant, where people will go in and find out, take part, participate in ceremonies, and then go out and try to replicate those ceremonies, which will lead to a whole battery of negative consequences. So to just enumerate survival tactics would be one way to control that. The Sitting Bull College, where I've had contact, which is located in Fort Yates, there are satellite colleges throughout the reservation at Standing Rock. They do have a IVR, and of course their permission. They can help you with getting permission from people who have volunteered to be part of the data, and also MOUs, which would be very helpful for sharing and management of the data. The end product always is toward the further healing of our people. And I always look in terms of policymakers too, like Katie said, and also just the hiring of traditional practitioners in our staffs at Indian Health Service at the behavioral health level, where Rockville, Maryland, the people back east that can make that change, and set up protocols where our traditional practitioners can be part of the research team at every step of the way, and even as consultants. I know of one who works in that manner, and I greatly respect him. He's from Pine Ridge, but he can use his knowledge of our cultural ways and our traditional healing practices in terms of guiding the Indian Health Service behavioral health where he works. So those are the types of, I guess, houseworking problems that would have to be worked out with Indian Health Service, but that's always toward the goal of helping our traditional practitioners be in a place where they can lead the way. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Loretta. You know, I'm so grateful for Loretta and our partners. As a non-native researcher, I have learned a lot. And I think, you know, when you're a non-native researcher, you have a colonized lens in which you see research. And so we know that unless you are doing the things that Loretta just said, right, you are having consultants, you're doing the type of participatory action work where they are partners along the way, like Katie and Bridget do, there are challenges that can come with this, and there can be harm that can come with this. And so we see that there are examples in the federal government's data that are inconsistent, right? Where data doesn't provide consistent updates, where it's irrelevant, where, you know, the federal government is using data and it's not providing data for the tribe. And then they're not able to use it, where there's been harm that's been done. And Laura was talking about ceremonies, right? And how significant that is. And then for researchers to come in, you know, and not really respect that. So there can be poor quality that comes with the data in terms of just not counting tribal members, not being able to accurately provide data on a specific question, producing and using in an environment of mistrust. And I think, you know, Loretta just talked about that so well, but that is a continued problem, and researchers can go in and do some harm, right? And then that also impacts not only tribes, but it impacts future research, right? And the ability for tribes then to have data moving forward too. And then also controlling external to non-native nations, which creates, you know, inconsistent or sometimes irrelevant and poor quality. And again, mistrust. The trust component is so important. And so thank you so much.
All right, thank you. So the central question to ask yourself when you are working on a research project, though there's a couple essential questions that Anna talked about, making sure you have partnerships and that you're doing the work that's located within tribes for tribes on behalf of, you know, you're working with them to answer the questions that they need answered, that you're working as part of that team. Another essential question that you're going to need to ask yourself is, at the end of this project, who is going to own this data? A good example of this is a project that Anna and I have, where we are actually working across a lot of different areas. We're working with the Native Women's Society of the Great Plains, which is a pan-tribal organization. It covers a lot of different organizations. And so before we applied for that grant, we had frank conversations with Native Women's Society, because it's not with a specific tribe. about at the end of this, who is going to own the data? Who's going to be the group that disseminates that data, makes the choices about who gets to access that data. So just making sure that you're aware of that essential question. If you are archiving data with the federal government, at the end of the grant, the federal government owns that data. They're the ones that are making the decision about who can access that. Now, again, as Katie talked about, there's a lot of asterisks on this because it really depends on the organization and how you do your data archiving plan. But if you are providing your data into a, just like an archive, or you're dumping your data into a, University of Michigan, the tribe no longer is going to control that data, and you're not going to control that data. The University of Michigan is going to control access to the data unless you can arrange something with them about review. And I think that's some uncharted land that we need to move through to figure out. So you need to be asking this question when you are preparing your grant, is who is going to own this data at the end? Who can use it for it? Is it going to be useful? And then is it going to be eligible to be used by the people who need to use it? Is it that ownership, is it violating sovereign rights, right? So sovereign is, yes, Sue, sorry, we are on the correct slide, thank you. So who will have right to grant access to that? Who will have the right to review reports? What kind of analysis needs to be done with that? All of that, if you're archiving it, if you're giving up control and the control's not going to the tribe, then who is the person that's going to have that control? And those are essential questions. The second thing to think about is if you are working with a sovereign nation, speaking with representatives from that nation and your partners about archiving with that tribe. Do they have code? Is their tribal code specific to archiving? Most of the Great Plains tribes in the Great Plains area that we've worked with don't have code. Some of them do, and some of them are in the process of developing. Or we're in the process of developing code when we went through and spoke to them. So they might actually now have code. So you need to see where they currently are with that when you start your process or start your research. Some of them, like Loretta talked about, Standing Rock, also Sisseton, Wahpeton, Oyate, and the Ogallala Sioux tribe have archiving in their tribe. They do archive, and they have those processes, some processes in place for that. So you need to know if the tribe that you're going to work with does, or what their stance is on it. Some tribes that we talked to were working towards this. They were working towards, if they didn't have a research review board, to developing a research review board, and are very interested in developing that. And so finding out if they have by the time that you start would be really good. Some nations have expressed an interest in actually archiving with the federal government because they don't have the capacity, the internal capacity at this point to do that. And so there were a few people that were like, well, this might be something we want to consider. You have to remember that tribal sovereignty means that not only do they have right to data sovereignty, they have the right to say that we want our data to live this place or that place, right? So they have that right. That's for you to find out from them what they want to do with that data. And so it crosses all lines. So it just really depends again, and you need to find out what your partner and the tribal nation that you're working with, or tribal nations, what their laws are. And if you are doing work that is across different tribal nations, you have to recognize that the answers might be different with each tribe, and the processes for getting research approvals and going through archiving and all of those are can be very different. If you have two partners, they might have completely different rules and codes and practices, and that you're going to have to figure those out and respect each nation's sovereignty in your work. There's also another consideration if you are doing work off tribal lands, like the project I was talking about with me and Anna, where we aren't working with a specific tribe. what do you do then to protect, do that added protection for working with Native populations and ensuring that your data and your results are actually being helpful to those populations that you're working for, and something that they can use to answer questions that they have or meet the needs of the questions or of the concerns that they have. One thing, and Katie alluded to this earlier, we frequently work with Indian Health Services through the Great Plains, which has a research review board that covers a larger area. So you could work with them to get research approvals and those processes and have that check that's provided on the data and a way to provide back. Of course, that is like it's called like it's like Aberdeen area. So there's other IHS services that you might be appropriate depending on where you work. We haven't done a lot of work with the tribes that share geography of North Dakota. So some of you on the call might have some insight in the North Dakota area that I'd be interested to learn more about as well. But there are ways to think through how you can make sure that you're doing your research in an ethical way that is providing answers back and useful information back to the people that you're working with on your study. And that's what you really need to think through. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So Katie's going to talk to you a little bit more about the kind of concerns that you should think about with when developing partnerships.
Thanks, Bridget and Anna and Loretta, for all of your wisdom and words of advice and encouragement as we've been talking through this so far today. Again, I really believe that the only ethical way to do research with Indigenous communities is participatory action, is community-led. I think, to me, that is something that is just so important. And I actually had no training in PAR in my graduate program, and it was the very first study that I did in the Haisapa Black Hills of present-day South Dakota that I learned, and I learned through the community, because I learned that the way that I had done research until then was not going to work, be unethical, potentially be harmful, and probably get me run out of town. And I'm lucky that I was surrounded by amazing people who really taught me, and I'm forever grateful for that. And PAR it's about values. It's the values that we bring to this work. And it's about walking in those values, and it's about making sure that the work that we're doing is really